Hello again. This video adds a few more thoughts about the Harrod-Domar model and its implications. Recall that the Harrod-Domar model is a foundational model in development economics, and it formed the basis for many more advanced models. However, the model's use in development economics was always a bit strange, because it was developed to deal with short-run recessions where the capital output ratio was constant and the nation suffered from excessive levels of unemployment, called surplus labor. Anyway, the conclusion of the Harrod-Domar model is codified in the famous Harrod-Domar equation, G equals S divided by K. The implication is that once we know the capital output ratio, the little k, and we have a target growth rate, the little g, then the only thing left is to ensure a sufficient level of savings, S. For example, if a nation has a capital output ratio of 3 and it wants to grow at 7%, then it just needs to save 3 times 7 equals 21% of its GDP. If the current savings rate is, say, 10%, then the nation suffers from a savings gap or a financing gap of 21 minus 10 equals 11%. To ensure the desired level of growth, 7%, we need to close the savings gap by providing foreign aid equal to 11% of the nation's GDP. Easy. Development is easy. Anyway, this thinking, capital constraint approach or capital fundamentalism, became the justification for massive transfers of capital and technology from the developed to the developing nations in the 1950s and 1960s. It was like a Marshall Plan for the developing world. However, sadly, this approach to development has not worked in general. Why might that be? First, although saving and investment are important to development, we might even say they are necessary conditions for development, but saving and investment are not sufficient conditions for development. Harrod-Domar and Rostow assumed that all relevant institutions were in place in developing countries, just like they were in Europe after World War II. But that was not true in general, and therefore just adding capital was not enough. 2. Although the Harrod-Domar model does not make it explicit, the model assumes surplus labor. This is, again, the reason for why the capital output ratio is believed to be constant. Under this assumption, the Harrod-Domar model shows that investment is a necessary condition for economic growth, or alternatively, a lack of investment would be a rigid constraint on growth. Capital constraint model. Using economic thinking, although this is not obvious, these assumptions are actually internally inconsistent. For example, assuming surplus labor implies that the price of labor will be very low. If labor is cheap, then the more profitable path to greater production and profit is to hire more workers, not adding more capital. The Harrod-Domar model has a problem related to incentives as well. As mentioned, the model calculates a required investment rate, compares this rate to the existing national savings rate, and then determines what the financing gap is, which should be closed by foreign aid. Clearly, there are some striking incentive problems here, since the greater the financing gap, the greater the amount of foreign aid. That is, the more a country or its leaders and population consume today, the less they will save today, but the less they save today, the greater the financing gap, and therefore the more foreign aid will they receive. So there is a clear incentive to not save and instead consume more. In sum, the Harrod-Domar model is based on some very strong assumptions, and it is not perfectly incentive compatible. Another problem is that it might be completely inappropriate to use a short-term model based on an assumption of surplus labor to explain long-term growth, especially since this model has no diminishing returns to capital, which is something that we believe in and that the solo growth model will add to our story shortly. Thank you.